Super elaborate paint schemes are the most overrated aspect when it comes to bass fishing. Like all these companies out there, and like swimbait companies are the worst about it. They're designed to catch you, the fisherman. Like they get super crazy with stencils and stuff and do all this stuff that really doesn't matter. So yeah, let's put all that to the side. Let's do a super deep dive into the biology of a bass. Figure out what about paint really drives those fish to be able to bite as opposed to just watch it go by. So in my opinion, there are 4 major characteristics when it comes to paint that makes a difference when catching a bass. The first one is the shade. And this is where do a little bit of research on your body of water, figure out what the primary forage is in your body of water. So if it's shade, if it's shad, go with something a little bit more shaddy looking, a little bit wider belly, darker top. If it's a perch, you're wanting some yellows in there with some or some vertical black lines. If it's bluegill, you want something kind of that copper color, a little bit of green in there, a little bit of texturing on the paint, just kind of general like shade, just general color tone of the fish that are in your body of water. And it goes a little bit more in depth than just like, oh, it's shad, just go white. If you fish for any amount of time, you'll notice that the dirtier the water, the brighter the fish are. And the cleaner the water you fish, the more dark and like, it's almost like the fish in the bodies of water get a suntan on them. It's crazy. So like if you catch a bass out of like no water, like it's crazy how absolutely dark those fish get. And that's because of their exposure to the sun. And the cleaner the water, the more the light penetrates the water, the darker the fish are. Now, the converse is true as well, where if it's dirty water, if they're a little bit deeper, they don't have as much sun hitting the fish directly, they're going to be a little bit more pale in color. And you should kind of choose your fish or your baits based off of that. So like dirtier water, go with something a little bit more pale. If it's bright, clean water, go with something that's a little bit darker overall. So the second characteristic that paint can really add to a bait, and the thing that you should be concerned about when it comes to choosing the bait you want to throw, is adding depth. So this can be done in a couple different ways. One, stenciling. So you can see there's a little bit of stenciling up here. It's going to add a little bit of depth to the bait. It makes it broken up just a little bit more. Fish in general are a little bit more naturally broken up. And I don't believe that this kind of this style, like the stenciling, adding depth, really makes that big of a difference unless you're in like super clean water. If you're in super clean water, like 20, 25 foot of visibility, they can hone in on it a little bit more, but in general, as you start kind of decreasing 10 foot of visibility, 5 foot of visibility, and even less, I prefer having texture on the bait is the best way to add depth. So I don't know if you can kind of see that kind of close up. When you add, the bait actually has a texture to it. What it does is it allows that paint to get in little nooks and crannies in different locations, and I believe that does a lot better job about adding depth to the bait and kind of making it look more real and more broken up in the water than just an elaborate paint scheme. I believe that fish can see that like just super, super flat bait and like, oh, it's just flat. Like that stenciling doesn't make that big of a difference as opposed to actual texture on a bait. The third paint characteristic that I believe makes a big difference when choosing a bait is color shift. So this is something that not a lot of bait builders and you find on a lot of crankbaits and stuff. It's a little bit more of expensive of paint, so it kind of deters a lot of people from going that route. But color shift is a huge deal. So especially in that kind of a little bit clearer water, anytime that sun hits that bait a little bit different. So it's a glide bait, swinging wide, going back and forth in the water. And if there's a little bit of ripple on the water, even better, because that's casting little bits of shadows on your bait. I believe that's why wind makes such a big difference when it comes to bass fishing, because it creates a ripple on the water and it makes your bait kind of like hit in and out of shadows really, really quick. And it adds a little bit of that secondary action. Color shift does the same deal. So like every time this bait's hitting a different ray of sunlight, it's got a little bit of ripple on the water, so it's hitting it different. Every time the bait is moving through the water, those fish are seeing it, and it almost looks like the muscles on a bait fish flexing just a little bit as they're going. And those little subtle details, I believe, can make a fish from a follower into one that commits. It can convince that that bait is real. So, and obviously, the making a bait look as real as possible is, I mean, that's a priority here, and that's what we're trying to get away from. Like a super like in-depth stenciling on it, I don't think makes that big of a difference. I'd rather have a bait with a ton of different color shift on it, so that way when it's coming through the water, it looks different from every angle, or a little bit different, just different enough to be able to make it look like that bait fish is moving throughout the water. So color shift, in my opinion, is a huge deal when it comes to fishing, solely because it adds secondary action. And another note on the secondary action when it comes to color shift, and I believe that texturing to the bait makes a huge difference here as well. So color shift on top of texturing on a bait takes it to another level. You've got the added depth with that kind of like maybe little dark spots kicking through in different angles. A little bit of body roll is going to help there as well. Just so a little bit of body roll, texturing on the bait, and color shift, I believe can take your bait to a whole nother level when it comes to getting those fish to actually commit. The fourth paint characteristic that I believe makes a big difference in glide bait fishing and just swim bait fishing in general is flash. This is not something that you always need, but it's something that when you're trying to get a certain kind of bite, which we're about to get into why fish bite a glide bait and what paint characteristics apply to those situations. But flash is a big deal in certain situations. And what I mean by flash, and I'll explain it on a crankbait level. So there'll be like a darker top crankbait, get this out of my pants, a darker top crankbait and a lighter bottom. When that crankbait is rolling, it creates a contrast between where the dark hits the light. So like where the dark was and then the light was, when it's doing that in the water, it's grabbing fish's attention. So a little bit of body roll is going to help create that flash that's going to get those fish's attention. So I think a little bit of body roll with a bait that contrasts on the bottom versus the top is great about creating flash, and that is very critical in those situations which we're about to get into. All right, in my opinion, there's 4 main reasons why a fish will bite a big swim bait, whether this be a glide bait, a soft bait, and every different bait category, like a multi-joint versus a soft bait versus a glide bait versus a wedge tail versus a paddle tail, they all excel in different situations. And these are the 4 main categories that I look at a bite and put them in, and then be able to adjust my baits that I'm fishing based off of that bite. So the first one is a hunger strike. In my opinion, when it comes to big swim bait fishing, this is hardly ever. Like, I feel like less than 10% of the big bait bites that I get, that fish is hungry and trying to eat it. It's hardly ever that you go out on the body of water. Say you're working all week and you got the weekend to go out. Like, hardly are you ever lucky enough to get it to the point where, oh yeah, that fish is hungry that day. So a hunger bite's pretty not super high on my list. And generally, if you just get something that looks like what they're eating in front of their face, they're gonna eat it. Kind of like balls of shad, kind of off to the side a little bit, something that looks kind of shaddy, looks like one flying away, they're gonna bite it. I believe that kind of a little bit more paint can matter here I think probably paint shade is the biggest thing when it comes to the hunger bite. Just get something in the general size, shape, profile, and just get it in their area, and they're gonna eat it. The second bite that I find fish have when hitting a big swim bait is a reaction bite. So something shooting by them really fast, something that they gotta make a split-second decision, like, do I gotta get it, do I gotta kill it, or do I let it go? Basically, you're not really scaring them, but you're scaring them. Like, you're scaring them into biting. And I believe the clutch darter is great at that. It's a super, super fast bait, and you're able to work it past them really, really quick and get that fish's attention. From a paint standpoint, I believe having contrasting colors makes a huge deal. You want to be visible. You want to get their attention, so contrast is big. Little bit of body roll's going to help you there. But it kind of goes back to that fourth characteristic that we were talking about, getting that flash out of the bait. Flash in a reactionary bite is huge. So if I caught a fish and I'm analyzing that bite, I'm figuring out why that fish bit the bait. And if I come to terms with, like, look, that fish reacted to that bait being in the area, it was a complete reaction bite. And generally, you can kind of tell that if you catch them on the outside of the mouth, they didn't really quite get it as good, like you made that fish react. So if I'm analyze the bite and I saw that, I'm going to probably lean a little bit more towards a darter, something a little bit faster, and I'm going to key off that fish's instinctual nature to be able to respond to a bait. So that's reaction bite. All right, the third bite that I believe that fish will have on a bait is, so let me explain it to you this way. So it's like a cat. It's almost like a cat. Like they see like an injured little like bug kind of scurrying across the floor, and their instinctual nature is to kill it. Bass have this same thing. If there's something that's just floating up there that's just kind of like looking dying, they're just like, it looks like it's just weak and it needs to be finished off. Bass's instinctual nature is to kill it. That's why a jerkbait works so well. That's why a topwater frog works so well. That's why topwater works well, is it triggers that bass's instinctual nature to kill the weak. So I think glide baits can really excel here, especially slower moving, wider gliding baits. It kind of looks like a fish just up there, just kind of like, just not doing super great, like, and it just triggers something deep, and that fish's just psychology that it's just gotta just finish it off. So slower movements here as far as paint's concerned. Gaudy doesn't necessarily excel in this situation, in my opinion. There's times like with smallmouth and stuff, it definitely can. I'd look more at the kind of just water conditions. Like if you're fishing really clean water, go with something darker. If you're fishing dirtier water, go with something brighter. It's the action in this instance that really makes a really, really big deal. I believe color is kind of secondary to this bite. Obviously, matching forage is definitely going to help you. So kind of keep that in mind if you're trying to trigger that instinctual nature in a bass. All right, the fourth bite on a big swim bait that I believe you get is the fun one. This is where you're pissing that fish off and you're making a territorial bite out of it. You're, again, super slow moving bait, I feel kind of excels in this situation, and you're just hanging it in its territory. So that's the queen of the laydown. That's big Tina over there. She's sitting there. She's like, this is my log. I'm not moving. This is mine. And you bring a big old 9.5, 10-inch bait. I feel like the bigger bait, the better in this situation. Kind of bring it over that log, and you want a super, super slow sink, and you just want it to hang there. And you just want to make her mad. She's like, what is that little fish think it's doing in my territory? No. And they come up and bite it. Now, followers happen a lot with this bite because sometimes they like, that timing just may not be right. Like they may be mad, but they're not super, super mad. And they're going to get up there and they're going to puff their fins, look around it, and like kind of just try to intimidate this fish off without actually attacking it. I believe a little bit more natural bait makes a big difference here in terms of paint scheme. Having that depth with the texture, having some color shift stuff definitely helps in this application. Little bit of body roll is probably pretty good to be able to kind of get that flash and kind of the attention of the fish from down there. That can probably definitely help. I believe hook size matters big on this one. I've seen a lot of territorial fish come up and stop, and like they literally see the treble hook. If you went back with a smaller treble hook bait, like one that they could barely see later, you're gonna catch that fish. But that territorial fish can come up, they can hit the bait high. They are smart. They know what a hook is. They're going to miss the treble hook on that bait. So keep your gear super in mind when it comes to that, because you're not necessarily getting something that's coming after it like super aggressive, like in terms to eat it. They're trying to kill it. They're trying to defend their territory. So that's the fourth bite that I believe that fish have on swim baits. All right, so that's the four paint characteristics and 4 bites that I believe that fish have on a bait and how paint affects those bites. So you're probably wondering, what's my all-around go-to color when it comes to throwing big swim baits? And in my opinion, it's bone. And this kind of depends. I fish a lot dirtier water, and let me explain to you why I believe bone is my all-around best fish catching color. So we talked about in that dirtier water how fish kind of get pale. And that's true, but when fish also get sick, they kind of lose the pigment in their body. Like they turn a lot paler of a color. So I believe a bone bait or something that's very kind of bright like this and dull really gets fish's attention that it's an injured, dying bait fish. So I believe it kind of keys off on all 4 of those bites. So if it's a weaker fish, not doing well, it's in their area, they're gonna bite it for hunger. It's a great reactionary bait because it's super bright and visible. So if you're working this over them and you're able to kind of like trigger that immediate response, like I better get that thing, white's a great color because it really gets a reaction. Like it's visible, like they can see it from a mile away. It also appeals to the 3rd characteristic because it just looks like that dying bait fish that they just absolutely want to kill. We already talked about how those bait fish, as they start getting more sick, they kind of lose their pigment. So it really kind of keys into those fish's nature of like, oh yeah, that's a dying bait fish. I better finish that thing off. And the 4th characteristic, the territory, like who wants a dying shad sitting in their house? Like, better make sure it gets out of there. And if it just hangs there, like they're gonna bite it. So that's why I believe in all 4 different situations, bone really excels. Now, as you start fishing some really clear water, if you start fishing that 5, 10, 15, 20 foot visibility, definitely gonna switch it up. Maybe a little bit more muted shad look or just kind of shad look in general. I believe that those are gonna probably play better, but all around a really good starting point is throwing bone. You're gonna catch a ton of fish on it, especially if you're fishing that little bit stingier or dingier water. So that's my breakdown of paint and what's important when. These baits are expensive. $100, $200, $300, $400 for a bait. Like, you gotta make sure that you're choosing something that's not just catching your attention. It's not catching the fisherman. It's actually designed to catch fish. And that's the biggest thing, because all these glide bait makers out there today are so laser focused on catching the fisherman. They're gonna do all these different super elaborate paint schemes and go super in depth and like really make it intricate to like catch your attention. You're like, man, that thing looks like an actual crappie. Well, I don't know about you guys, but those super, super lifelike baits never end up working out as well as I was hoping. Like, it's always the thing that's just slightly off that really triggers those fish into biting. And these 4 characteristics that we laid out in terms of paint is what I look for when choosing a swim bait. It's what I look for in choosing a jerk bait, everything. And I believe that it leads to me catching more fish in the end because I'm not focused on what all the major companies are telling me that I need to buy to be able to catch that fish. I'm looking at the instinctual nature of a bass and allowing the bass to tell me what to do to catch more of them. So, like and subscribe for more videos to come. I love doing the super in-depth breakdown stuff, like getting super nerdy about the intricate details of bait design that actually matter in fishing. So, like and subscribe for more stuff to come. We'll see you guys.